Hello and welcome to the Arab Digest podcast. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest newsletter, and my guest today is a Syrian analyst and pollster, Malik al-Abdeh, managing director of conflict mediation solutions and editor-in-chief of the online magazine Syria in Transition. Malik, good to have you back on the podcast.
Pleasure to be back, Bill.
Now, you're in Syria, and I've just seen reports that last week there was rioting broken out in several cities across the country. Can you tell us where you are right now and the situation as you're seeing it?
Yeah, I'm in Damascus at the moment. It's been almost a month that I've been here, and it's been very eye-opening, really. Let me begin just with the issue of the riots, because I think they're quite illustrative of the mood these days. So these really the causes of these riots is primarily economic, and that's really the major headline in Syria because of the cost of living crisis. Everything's getting more expensive. People feel that they have less money in their pockets. I mean, unlike the previous regime where you had to queue for everyday essentials, but at least they were cheap. Now you don't have to queue, but everything's expensive. So that's the trade-off. And because of the growing economic dissatisfaction that has now burst into the open, there's real tensions between those who have come back. These are refugees or IDPs who are in northern Syria who've come back to their homes and have struggled to really start from scratch as compared to those who have remained under the Assad years, and many of whom collaborated with the regime and made real fortunes. And so that disparity between those who've returned with nothing and those who've remained, collaborated with the former regime, and have been allowed to keep much of their wealth, that has been really the root cause for a lot of the dissatisfaction and a lot of the rioting. Now, there are what could be, construed as conspiracy theories of why these riots broke out at that specific time. People have speculated that perhaps elements within the new government have an interest in this violence breaking out. But regardless, there is genuine frustration, especially by those who are considered revolutionaries, who've been forced to leave their homes under Assad. And yeah, they look at those who've remained and they've kept their homes and they're doing very well. And of course, some of that anger is also directed at the government, which has allowed these people to continue to live and keep their money. And the government hasn't really attempted to introduce any transitional justice process where these people are either are imprisoned if they're found guilty of crimes, or they have to pay some sort of reparation. That process hasn't happened, which has only made things worse.
Yeah, yeah. And speaking about the economic situation, the transitional government led by Ahmed al-Sharaa published what they called a statement of recovery priorities back in March. So what are your thoughts on the document? It doesn't sound like they've done much with whatever priorities they've established.
Yeah, I mean, in short, I mean, this document stresses that aid has to flow through the state. In the past, as in the past 15 years, most of the aid has gone through non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, and this has created almost a parallel administration in Syria that runs everything from clinics to psychosocial support to schools. What the government now wants is to say, right, we've had enough of that. We now have a legitimate government. So all this aid has to flow through the government. That's in short what the recovery priorities, that's sort of the philosophy of that document. And they want much of the aid to focus on things like infrastructure, service delivery, public administration. So essentially to support the state as opposed to NGOs. And I would actually sympathize with that position because the only sustainable way to have recovery in Syria is to rebuild the state. Now, there's a lot of question marks over whether that is actually taking place and how well that process is going. But in principle, I think it's correct. And this bloated NGO sector needs to be reduced to a manageable size and a realistic size because it has become too big over the past 15 years. And we're already seeing a lot of the NGOs now either merging into state institutions or folding altogether. And there's now a greater priority on things like economic recovery, which is what most Syrians want. Syrians don't want more handouts, although unfortunately many donors are still reluctant to let go of humanitarian aid. They want to focus on humanitarian aid. And the Syrian government, and I think a lot of the Syrian people that I've spoken to move beyond that.
Mhm. Well, okay. Rebuilding Syria will cost, according to the World Bank, $216 billion. Now, it's my understanding the Saudis and the Qataris are the big contributors, but I'm just wondering what sort of return on investment are they expecting, and how much influence do they get out of plowing that money into the reconstruction of Syria?
Well, as far as I can see, the Saudis and the Qataris haven't really invested all that much. I mean, they've given money to the government to keep the civil service payroll going, to pay for civil servants and to maintain basic functions, but they haven't really given money directly to the government to begin any sort of reconstruction. They've encouraged private sector actors to move into Syria, but obviously, private sector actors will pick the most lucrative sectors of the Syrian economy, such as telecoms, such as airports. And these don't necessarily reflect in better living conditions for Syrians. These are many of these projects are prestige projects. So the governments of Saudi Arabia and Qatar and so on and the UAE haven't really invested anything like what was expected. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think part of that is, and this is what, let's say, the politicos in Damascus are speculating, there's an American veto on large scale investments by these Gulf countries, and that may be linked to certain conditions that the United States puts on the Syrian leadership. We've heard President Donald Trump talk about wanting Syria to intervene in Lebanon to fight Hezbollah, for example. Should Syria decide to do that, that may unlock some of this aid. But so far, we haven't seen any evidence of large scale Gulf government money being pumped into Syria. And what's interesting is that the Syrian government itself is not talking about reconstruction as such. They are talking about specific investment opportunities that they're trying to market. But there is no grand narrative about, rebuilding after the war, let's say, of the kind that, post-World War II Europe, for example. So the government itself isn't promising reconstruction, let alone, working to get that kind of huge, the tens of billions required to do it. Instead, what they're promoting is lucrative, real estate deals and so on. So there's no evidence, let's say, of large-scale reconstruction. Many of the districts around Damascus, for example, that were destroyed during the war, they remain destroyed. And whatever rebuilding that has taken place has been taking place out of private initiative, not because of anything government driven.
Mhm. Yeah, just want to pick up on one of the things you said, this idea that Trump may be pressuring al-Sharaa to send Syrian troops in to deal with Hezbollah. That sounds completely mad. Surely Sharaa can't go along with that.
Yeah, I mean, the polling that I've done indicates that more than 60% of Syrians oppose such a move, and it does sound mad on paper. I think in reality, perhaps what is meant when Trump says Syria has to go in and fight Hezbollah or confront Hezbollah is more of a return of Syrian tutelage over Lebanon rather than necessarily a military occupation. So, Lebanese politicians are expected to work with the Syrian leadership in order to quote unquote resolve their own problems. And that may not necessarily involve Syria fighting Hezbollah deep inside Lebanese territory. I mean, Syria may decide to do a buffer zone under the pretext that, Hezbollah is engaged in cross-border smuggling of weapons and so on. But really, what we're talking about here, and I think this is something that Ahmed al-Sharaa, President Sharaa, hinted very clearly in his latest TV interview by a Lebanese interviewer. He hinted that we want to work closely with the Lebanese government, and so the idea is that this would be a government-to-government cooperation to solve some of their problems. And Hezbollah is most certainly a challenge for the Lebanese government. Does that mean, Syria going in and invading Lebanon? Maybe not in such a brutal fashion, but there could be a security cooperation between the Lebanese army and the Syrian army. At least this is how Syrians are interpreting Ahmed al-Shara's statements.
Okay, yeah. That seems like a big ask to me, given all the issues that you've already discussed that Syria faces. But what about Turkey? Turkey was a big backer of al-Sharaa. And we've talked in the past about this competition between the Israelis and the Turks over who got the bigger chunk of Syria. Uh, what about Turkey and their influence now with the al-Sharaa government?
Yeah, and look, Turkey isn't entirely happy with the transition as it's unfolding. Turkish officials privately complain about certain aspects, such as lack of inclusion of certain elements of Syrian society in decision making, namely the Turkoman minority in Syria, who have been largely excluded. So Turkey is not, is critical about certain aspects. However, its eye is mainly on Aleppo as it's, let's say, ground zero of influence in Syria, at least in terms of economics. We've seen a recent visit by Bilal Erdogan, the son of President Erdogan, to Aleppo, where he was greeted as a head of state. Turkish companies are getting contracts from the Aleppo municipality. We've seen hospitals in Damascus, for example. There's a famous heart hospital that has been essentially the administration of which has passed to a Turkish organization. And when you walk in, everything's in Turkish, Turkish flags. Doctors and nurses are all Turkish, so it's not exactly subtle. Turkey does have a lot to give Syria, but at the same time, there is, I think, unease over how overbearing perhaps Turkish influence can be, and also how much very visible Turkish influence in Syria will put off Arab countries, UAE, the Saudis, for example, but also antagonize Israel, which is something that the Syrian leadership doesn't want. But as long as Syria continues to suppress Kurdish ambitions in the northeast, and the talks on SDF integration are still ongoing, though those have not concluded. Um, uh, Also, for Syria to remain within the Turkish orbit geostrategically on things like the Eastern Mediterranean oil and gas files, and also for Syria to become a de facto buffer for Turkey vis-a-vis Israel. Turkey is investing very heavily in the Syrian army. They're giving them equipment. They want the Syrian army to be a powerful enough deterrent against Israel. And of course, President Sharaa also wants to have a strong and powerful army. So as long as Syria plays along on those three issues, the economic file, the Kurdish file, and as continues to maintain not necessarily an antagonistic position towards Israel, but certainly a position of extreme caution towards Israel, I think Turkey would remain relatively happy with how things are proceeding.
Okay, well, let's talk about Israel. The IDF has carved out a zone of influence, a buffer zone in southwest Syria. Netanyahu says there's no intention to leave. But Malik, surely al-Sharaa cannot accept that situation. And Israel it remains a threat. The question is how big a threat, and what is Sharaa going to do about getting the Israelis out, if indeed he can get them out?
Bottom line is he can't. He can't get them out. And he knows that the only way he can get them out is through diplomacy. And this is where the Lebanese card comes in. I mean, the last time we spoke, we discussed how a potential Syrian intervention in Lebanon could help unlock Shara's Israel problem. And that may well still be on the cards. And also, it's worth mentioning that Israel is perhaps the second biggest threat to Ahmed al-Sharaa, the first being Iran, because, if Iran wants to, let's say, get revenge after the war with Israel and the US, if Iran really wants to, let's say, as euphemistically, reshuffle the cards, basically cause chaos in the Levant region and turn the tables on the US and Israel, it would seek to eliminate Ahmed al-Sharaa and really destabilize Syria. And so Iran probably has a greater incentive to do that than Israel does. So perhaps Israel is the second biggest threat to Syria after Iran from that perspective. And of course, Syria and Israel have a common enemy, which is Iran. So the question is, can Syria and Israel work out a sort of relationship where they come together to fight Iran or to limit Iranian expansion? I think my view is that from the Syrian leadership perspective, they would love that. And they've attempted to push for that from day one. The problem is that, from Israeli perspective, their issue is, we might get short-term gains against Iran and Hezbollah, but long-term wise, we might be creating a new beast, potentially a more dangerous one than even Hezbollah, because Ahmed al-Sharaa could be the new Nasrallah, Turkey could be the new Iran. I mean, in Israel, they're already talking about Ahmed al-Sharaa, or some of the extreme ministers in the Israeli government referring to Ahmed al-Sharaa as a jihadist in a suit. So really, the Israeli apprehensions about Syria is more, let's say, medium to long term rather than short term. Short term, they can manage the situation. They don't feel much pressure in Syria. No one's fighting them in Syria. But if they do enter into a deal that provides short-term relief against Hezbollah, well, the long-term consequences of that will be another war in, 5 or 10 years' time.
You're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and the Syrian analyst Malik al-Abdeh, Managing Director of Conflict Mediation Solutions and an Editor-in-Chief of the online magazine Syria in Transition. For more on what Arab Digest has to offer, head to our website, arabdigest.org, where you can find details on how to subscribe to our reader-supported daily newsletter. Sign up and you'll receive the first 2 months free. That's arabdigest.org. The sectarian issues, how severe are they? I was looking at the situation affecting Alawites and the attacks on Alawite women and girls. And is al-Sharaa dealing with sectarianism, or is he using sectarianism to maintain his power base?
Well, I think the short answer is both. On the one hand, he can't legitimately claim to be a state actor without protecting Syrian citizens, regardless of their ethnic or religious affiliation. So the security forces in Syria have intervened to stop violence against minorities and against the Alawis in particular in various places. I mean, the most recent case occurred about just over a week ago in a suburb of Damascus that is mainly Alawite, populated mainly by Alawites, and there was violence against them as part of a more nationwide outburst of violence that we spoke about earlier in this interview. And the security forces did intervene and put a stop to it. So on the one hand, we're seeing the security forces protecting minorities, but let's say on a more grand narrative level, it's hard for the government to maintain its degree of support within the Sunni majority without resorting to some form of sectarian rhetoric. Part of this is because of the, let's say, the DNA of HTS, the group that Ahmed al-Sharaa used to lead. I mean, this group is now disbanded and is part of the state, but it's in effect, it's the de facto ruling party. Um, the DNA of this group is religious, it's an Islamist party, and therefore, because of that fact, it has an antagonistic view of religious minorities, but specifically heterodox Muslim minorities, Alawites, Druze, Ismailis, and so on. And so it's very hard not to, it's very hard for those members of HTS who are now in a leadership position in the state, when you ask them about minorities like the Alawites, for them not to express opinions which could be construed as sectarian. And of course, that's reflected, of course, in the narrative towards the Sunni majority as a whole. The idea that if we don't stick with the current leadership, the Alawites will come back and they will commit massacres as they did in the past. And this grand narrative is really quite powerful. And I always, I always tell many of my Sunni friends, I say, the Sunnis are now the new Alawites in the sense that they have the same relationship as the Alawites did to Hafiz al-Assad, who was himself an Alawite. The idea that if you betray the current government, you're betraying your own sect. And this is a very powerful way of keeping people in line. And I think the current government is using that quite skillfully, really, to keep Sunnis on side, despite the fact that economically things are declining. The reconstruction that was promised hasn't materialized. A lot of the promises that were made, or many of the expectations that people had in the beginning, also haven't materialized either. And so playing the sectarian card is part of the way that this government is trying to maintain power. That's not to say that they're encouraging people to go out and kill Alawites necessarily, but it's more about keeping Sunnis on side.
Yeah. Well, okay. Let us drill down a little more because your organization, Syrian Transition, has just released a new poll, and I had a look at it. It's not a positive picture about how the Syrian people are feeling towards the government and the direction the country is headed in. So, what concerns you most about the findings from that poll that you've just brought out?
What concerns me the most is really a sense of apathy that is coming through from some of these results, but also through anecdotally through the research team that undertook the poll. For example, when we asked people about the People's Assembly, which is Syria's parliament, um, we're not sure when it's going to convene. I mean, we hope soon. But the membership of the People's Assembly is likely to be announced very soon. And we asked people about that. Most people just didn't know. I mean, they just either didn't know or didn't care about this assembly, which is really a dangerous indicator. If democracy and accountability are your thing, if you believe in those things, then that should be concerning. So there's a degree of apathy towards, let's say, democratic or so semi-democratic institutions. Of course, the People's Assembly isn't entirely directly elected. It was indirectly elected, but nevertheless, it serves a useful purpose. So that's for me was not entirely unsurprising, but concerning. Similarly, I think there's also a failure of government communications. I think that's another a takeaway from this poll. So, for example, we asked respondents whether they were familiar with how the government handled the SDF integration, this deal that was done between the government and the SDF back in January.
That's the
And
Kurdish forces in the northeast, yeah.
correct, and how that integration is how they rated the government's integration or handling of the SDF file, let's put it that way. And most people, 63% people just didn't know. I mean, and that also suggests that the government just hasn't been communicating what's been happening in the Northeast very effectively. So that's another, I would say, failure. I think the other major failure is with regards to transitional justice. And we asked respondents whether they thought that the trial of Atif Najib, which was one of the big security chiefs in Syria in the early years of the war, who was believed to have, tortured children, and he's a cousin of Bashar al-Assad. And he was put on trial recently, and this was a televised trial, so sort of Nuremberg-esque. And we asked people whether that trial made them, let's say, trust that perpetrators will be brought to justice, so that whether they had faith in the transitional justice process. And 36% said no, only 28% said yes, and 26% just didn't know. And again, there's a sort of uncertainty and there's doubt about the value of these trials and what these trials actually show. Does it show justice being done, or are people just confused about who the real perpetrators were? I think that's also something very, very concerning.
Any bright spots in the polling, Malik?
Amid all this, let's say, less favorable data, especially when it comes to things like government approval rating, I mean, that has also gone down from 25% to 20%, for example. There's also some, let's say, glimmers of optimism. So, there is broad support for teaching of democratic values in schools. This is a question that we asked, which is part of a series on educational reform that we're publishing. So that's a positive indication. I mean, most people still believe that Russia should be held accountable for the crimes it committed during the war. Most people, for example, 67% believe that there should be a peaceful negotiated solution to the problem between the government and the Druze in Sweden, for example. So there are, let's say, indications that the people do hold progressive views on a lot of issues. It just so happens that I think when it comes to government performance, I think the figures are less, let's say, less positive.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm thinking too that, the window may be closing for al-Sharaa in terms of building popular support and the reconstruction. And as you said, the districts of Damascus that still lie in ruins, while private enterprise is building what, I don't know, hotels or luxury developments or whatever, that is really critical. And surely he needs to move on that front.
Well, look, in the past few weeks, I've met with people in the government, and one thing that has come across, and they all agree on, is that there is no narrative for where we're going and what this government is meant to achieve and how we're meant to achieve it. There is a lack of narrative. The people just don't know what this government is meant to achieve. And I think that is a huge, huge problem, especially for a country emerging out of war. I think clarity on those issues, um, putting aside even the political side and the rebuilding of national identity and so on, even just economically, are we heading towards a neoliberal Gulf style sort of capitalist state? Because that would be a, a massive departure from the model that Syria has had for the past 50, 60 years. Or are we maintaining, let's say, a basic welfare state while introducing market reforms gradually? I mean, just yesterday, I spoke to someone who's very familiar with the health sector and the health ministry. And he said, yeah, I mean, dozens of hospitals are going to essentially be given over to private operators, some of whom are quite disreputable, actually. Um, he thought they were quite disreputable, and but that somehow this was going to happen, and the health ministry is going along with this. And so this also is a very deep question. An issue of how healthcare is provided is very much at the core of the social contract. And if there is no clarity about that, then I think people's patience will wear very thin. And I think already there are indications from polling and also anecdotally that people are getting fed up of not knowing where things are headed. There's a sort of a sense of uncertainty. And this is also putting off investors, by the way. I mean, the government is meant to be encouraging investment, and that's all fine and well. But There is and while the security situation is good in Damascus and in the major cities, there is a sort of uncertainty about not just about, that something unpredictable could happen. There is this sense in the country, but also about economic policy itself. Things could change very quickly. So there hasn't been a plan that's been published that says right from now until like 3 or 4 years from now, this is what we're going to do. And this lack of clarity, whether on economic side, political side, socially also, what does it mean to have reconciliation in the country? What does transitional justice look like in the Syria context? There's no clarity about any of these issues, and there's no grand narrative that combines all these different elements into one big story.
Mm.
And even if, if President al-Sharaa was to lay out such a vision very clearly and say, look, we're going to have to endure hardship in the next 2 or 3 years, but year four, things are going to start to improve. If he comes out and says that, I think a lot of people will say, right, okay, fine, we get it, and we're prepared to go along with that. But that's not happening. I mean, that hasn't happened, and I'm not sure whether it will happen. I have a feeling that President Shara likes this sort of creative ambiguity. He likes this state of creative ambiguity where he's not really held accountable to anything that is written or published, whether it's a manifesto, whether it's a pledge. Um, so he has maximum maneuverability and he can
Mm.
do pretty much what he likes. But I mean, that has its positives, but also when you're ruling 23 million people, those people have expectations as well.
Yes, which they deserve after everything that Syria has been put through. They deserve to have those expectations realized, at least in part. And in terms of narrative and the work that Syria in Transition is doing, the polling, I hope that the government people you're talking to, they're taking on board what those polls are telling you, because they should be telling the government it's time to get a narrative of a clear narrative moving forward. But in the meantime, I'm going to thank you for the conversation today, Malik.
Always a pleasure, Bill, and look forward to future conversations.
My guest today on the Arab Digest podcast was the Syrian analyst, Malik al-Abdeh. Arab Digest is an independent voice on the Middle East, North Africa. You'll have noticed we bring the podcast with no sponsors and no advertising. It's the same for our daily newsletter. We're supported only by our subscribers. We are an independent voice. For more information on subscriptions, if you sign up, we're offering 2 months free. Head to our website, arabdigest.org. There you'll find a team of experts covering developments in the Arab world with outstanding analysis and sharp insights. Follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn, and search our library of more than 300 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or other platforms. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest. Essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.